Hello, welcome again. We're in Nehemiah 7 today. Thank you, Simon, for the song. I always love to sing songs about heaven. That's Zion. I'm a Zionist, but Zion's in heaven. So today we're carrying on in our Walking with God, Walking Each Other Home series. And we're carrying on with our book. We're in Nehemiah chapter 7 today. Thank you for those listening at home. I hope my mum is listening. I hope my mum was feeling very well today. So Nancy's gone to be with my mum today. So thank you very much, Nancy, for going and staying with her while I came here to preach. So in Nehemiah chapter 7, we're going to pick up just in verse 1. And it says, "After the wall had been rebuilt, and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers, the musicians, and the Levites were appointed. I put in charge of Jerusalem my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most people do." Let's just stop there. I want to be like Hananiah. A man of integrity and someone who feared God more than most people do. Sounds like a great guy. I want to be like him. Well, so what is biblical integrity? The idea of biblical integrity is the alignment of our inner character with God's truth of honesty, purity, and faithfulness, both in public and in private. Or maybe it's just living as the same person before God when we're alone and when we're with people out in public. That's biblical integrity. Saying who we really are, but not just for show, but really deep down in our heart. That it's part of our character. And the biblical integrity comes from fearing God. Fearing God is to have a deep, joyful, reverent awe of God that leads us to a humble worship, wholehearted obedience, and turning away from all evil. Reverent awe is knowing the powerful God, knowing that He personally created you with intent. You know, you're not randomly here. You're not just atoms of a dead star that have randomly come together and then randomly life has formed and randomly the whole ecosystem has appeared in such a perfect situation. You're not here by random accident. You are here because there's a loving God who made you with intent. Who knitted you together in your mother's womb. Amen. And placed you here on earth. You were created purposely. And we know that one day we're going to meet Him again. In Romans 14, verses 10 to 12, it says, the Apostle Paul writes, "You then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? For we'll all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, 'As surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me, every tongue will acknowledge God.' So then, each of us will give an account of ourselves to God." You know, we can be in reverent awe. This is the God who created us. This is the God who will one day we return to. But also knowing that God loves us so much. He's actually your biggest cheerleader. No one on this earth loves you more than God. He is the God of love. God is love, not the God of love. He defines love. God is your biggest cheerleader. He is rooting for you every day. So much so, he's willing to let his son die on the cross and take the penalty of your sin, your lies, your judging others, your evil thoughts. And he's willing to go and take that penalty because God is just. Right? God is a just God. He's perfect. Heaven is perfect. So, ourselves, we're not perfect. We can't go to heaven as our imperfect selves. Because we would make that perfect place imperfect by us being there. Yeah, in the same way, if I have a perfect glass of water and I put just a tiny bit of cyanide in that glass of water, it's not a good idea to go and drink it. It's no longer perfect. It's only a wee bit. But that's why we can't go to heaven in our sinful states, in our sinful selves. God is just. As much as God is merciful, the justice is just as important as well. It's a paradox. It's a paradox. How can we, as sinners, get to heaven and be with God where it's all perfect? It's impossible. It's impossible by our own efforts. And that's where Jesus comes in. Jesus was willing to sacrifice himself and take that penalty and make us perfect so we could enjoy fellowship with God for eternity. That's incredible. We get clothed with Christ. That's amazing. That's amazing. I don't know if I just read this. So in Romans 5:8, it says, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Not because we were good, but because we were sinful, Christ died for us. That's incredible. I appreciate Mike's communion. Right? We might as well pack up and go home if Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Right? Because it's not about having good friendships. It's not about having relationships. It's not about the community. All of these things are great in church. But that's not the point. The point is Jesus died and was raised again. This is what it's all about. I love the hymn, "How Great Thou Art." And it speaks about the greatness of God. And I love driving into the mountains, when it talks about, sort of the mountains and things. And I often think about that hymn, "How Great Thou Art." But I love the last verse of this. And it refers to being awe in the presence of God. I'm not going to sing it, but I'll just read it out. It says, "When Christ shall come with shouts of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart? Then I shall bow in humble adoration and then proclaim, 'My God, how great thou art.'" That's incredible. This will happen. It's going to be awesome. We have the account of the Apostle John entering the heavenly realm in the book of Revelation. No S. John had spent 3 years with Jesus during his ministry on earth. And he'd even met the risen Christ. He'd shared a meal with the risen Christ on the seashore. He knew Jesus. He really did. He knew he'd met Jesus, which we haven't done. He had seen the risen Jesus. He'd spent time. He was part of that inner circle of 3 of the closest apostles. And then he meets Jesus in all his glory in the heavenly realm. And in Revelation 1, verses 17 to 19, we see his reaction of meeting Jesus in heaven. "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, but now look, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore what you have seen, for what is now and what will take place later.' John finally meets Jesus in the heavenly realm. Not the Jesus who came from glory onto earth, but the Jesus who is now in full glory in heaven. And he falls at his feet as if dead. He is in true awe of Jesus. Are we in awe of Jesus? Jesus is real. He really is. Joe asked me to be part of a Christian Union event at Caledonian University this week, and it was like open questions to Christians, and one of the questions like, why do you have faith? Why do you have faith in God? Why do you have faith in the Bible? And one of my answers, I have many reasons, but one of my answers, and the answer I gave was, there was 12 apostles. One died, one betrayed Jesus, there was 11 left. And 10 of them died because of their faith. They saw the risen Jesus. They'd been with him for 3 years. They'd not got him for a lot of that time. We read in the Gospels that they didn't really understand. They're not really the heroes. If you're going to make something up, at least make it up so you're the hero. Yeah. They're not all sort of shining like stars in the Gospels. And then Jesus dies. They scatter. They're gone. They're going back to their old jobs. But then they meet the risen Jesus. And that's incredible. They changed the world. These guys who had no faith, who kept on sort of doing the wrong thing, suddenly they see the risen Jesus and they change the world. It's not based on faith. They saw it with their eyes. There was no faith with the apostles. It was totally based on sight. That's incredible. That's why their testimony, what we read in the Gospels, that's why it's true. That's why we can rely upon it. Because it's not written by people who had faith. It's written by people who actually had sight, who saw it with their own eyes. And they never, not one of them said, as they died, no, we read it all up. Don't kill me. It was all a lie. They all went to their deaths. The only one who wasn't was John, who we just read about. He didn't also have a very good time of it. He was put into burning oil as well. Not a very pleasant experience. So this is tough for these guys, but they died for their faith. And it's on their testimony, really, what we stand and we come before today. That's amazing. Jesus is real. There's so many other things. A couple of weeks ago, I was with Parza in London, and I had the privilege of going and taking Parza to the British Library, see the oldest Bible in the world, back to about 325 AD. And then we went to the British Museum, saw different artifacts in there. One of my favourite artifacts in the British Museum is there's probably Shebna's gravestone. They can't make it out fully, but they think this is Shebna's gravestone from Isaiah. So Jerusalem is surrounded, excuse me, and one of the royal steward is chiseling out his own grave and making kind of a big show of it. And Isaiah challenges him and says, "What are you doing? You're very demoralizing the people, because you're supposed to be leading them, and you're chiseling out your gravestone." And he rebukes him. But that gravestone's in the British Museum. I think that's amazing. You can actually see the Bible coming to life. That's it. I can read about it. I can see it. That's amazing. This is true, and it's got to have an impact with us. It's got to change us. There's many stories in the Bible of we see change people of integrity and people who fear God. So can I ask somebody to just go get some water for me? Sorry. Otherwise I'm going to cough my way through this sermon. In Genesis, we see Joseph. Joseph is one of my heroes in the Bible. Again, I would like to be like him. Maybe not always have his struggles. He had a few challenging times. He was a bit of an arrogant boy to begin with. In Genesis 37, verse 5, he said, it says, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Thank you, my lovely daughter. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were all binding our sheaves of grain out in the field, and suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves, they gathered around mine, and they bowed down to it. And his brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. You know, God had destined great things for him. But he was very proud and he was very arrogant with the way he displayed it. And he thought he was better than other people. And over a period of literally decades, God had worked on his character. Until the point where he's before Pharaoh and he has this opportunity, he ends up in prison for something he didn't do, and he has this opportunity to get out of prison. And he has the ability to interpret dreams. So Joseph, he knew that God had given him these dreams. He knew that God had given him the power to interpret dreams. Has this opportunity to go before Pharaoh. And if I had that power, I'll be, Pharaoh, yeah, I can do it. I can interpret your dream for you. Absolutely, I'm the man. Because that's the type of boy he was when he first got these dreams. But his heart had changed. He became the humble servant of God. So later on in Genesis 41, verse 16, he's now before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's told him a dream. And he's asking him, can you interpret this dream? And he says, I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. He has changed his attitude. Joseph allowed God to work on his sinful character and turn him into a man of integrity. God took him apart. He was taken away from his family. He was taken away from those who loved. He was sold into slavery, falsely accused, in prison unjustly. But all the time, God was working. All the time, God was with him. He didn't get bitter. He orientated himself towards God. What about ourselves? Does our pride tell us that we're better than others? What do you do when things don't go so well? What do you do when you get mistreated? Do you get bitter? Do you look inward and have a victim mindset? It's all their fault. Nothing to do with me. It was all them. Or do we allow God to work in the situation? Because if we allow God to work, then we learn what it means to have integrity, and we learn what it means to fear God. 3 people's integrity and fear of God I love is found in Daniel chapter 3. Daniel can interpret dreams like Joseph. A bit later on, they're now in the Israelites, and they're now in captivity, or the Jews are now in captivity, and the King Nebuchadnezzar, he has a dream about a big statue, and it represents the kingdoms that will follow. And the king, he kind of doesn't really totally hear Joseph. He hears what he wants to hear, really. And he decides to build a giant statue of himself in response to this dream. And he says, I've made this big statue, and to go and commemorate this big statue, I'm going to get all the officials of the land all together, and then they're going to come together, and they're going to bow down and worship my image in this statue. Because we think that's a really good idea. That's definitely in line with what Daniel said with his interpretation of my dream. Not really. And anyway, there's some Jews also been taken away with Daniel into captivity. And they refuse to bow down to that statue, even though the consequences could be deadly. And I really love the integrity that we see of these three friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your hand, your majesties. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. They were not arrogant. They were trusting in God. They knew that God is sovereign. They knew that God is powerful. And they knew that God is present. But even if he does not, what a phrase is that? They knew that God wasn't a genie. I believe in God, therefore God's going to do what I say. They knew that God was still God, that God was sovereign in this situation. But even if he does not, they knew that they could still die in that situation. Their faith was without condition. Their obedience without guarantee. There's a difference in trusting in God and using God. We use God when we start to make deals. God, if you do this, then I'll do that. I'll be more godly if you bless me in this way here. We make these deals with God. That's not God. That's not trusting in God. That's not showing integrity. That's using God. So they get thrown into the furnace. Right? King Nebuchadnezzar, not particularly happy. He's got he's a kind of big, powerful leader, probably the most powerful leader in the world at that time. Had a bit of a thin skin, and didn't like being told, things other than what was his will. So anyway, these three people, he decides to chuck them into the burning furnace. But God really does protect them. And he gets up and he says, look, I see 4 men wandering around a fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the Son of God's. That's Daniel 3:25. They were protected. God was with them. Not a hair was singed, nor was the smell of smoke was on them. They allowed God to work, and God showed up. See, at that time, at that point in history, in that furnace was the safest place on earth. Because God showed up. Do we allow God to work in the furnaces of our lives? We all have our own spiritual furnaces that we go through. If we allow God to work, God shows up.
Yeah. Awesome.
See, in the New Testament, we see also disciples being in awe of Jesus. They were going across the lake. And a furious storm, this is in Mark chapter 4. It says a furious storm came up, in verse 37. And the waves broke over the boat. And it was that they were nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up. He rebuked the winds and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And the waves died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why were you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Jesus wanted the disciples to have trusted him, to have trusted their God, to understand who's in control and who was sovereign in the situation. But instead, they focused on the storm. They were people who knew about the lake. They were people who knew about boats. But they looked at the storm. They hadn't figured out who was in their boat. The fact is, they were with Jesus. They were actually in the safest place. Even with the water coming in over the boat and then bailing it out, being swamped, they were still in the safest place. They were safe before and after Jesus calmed the storm. They were still safe in that storm. They were always safe because Jesus was there. Because Jesus was in the boat. In that point in history, the safest place on the whole planet in that storm was in that boat.
Yeah.
It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't pleasant, but it was safe. Jesus never promised it would be comfortable to follow him or to be near him. But he does promise that he'll be near you. What are your storms in your life? And do you see Jesus? Who's in your boat? What do you put your trust in when life gets stormy? See, peace doesn't come from finding a lake without storms. Peace comes from having Jesus in your boat.
Yeah.
The with Jesus life is one of adventure. Life may be more challenging with Jesus than without. You know, there's people who you'll interact with, and you will be their only contact with the gospel. Jesus has commissioned you to go and share it. This week, my work colleague, over the last couple of years or so, I've been sitting next to my work colleague. You know, and as just Christians, we share our lives and stuff. And, you know, just been talking to him. I've shared different things with him. He had no faith, and still pretty much almost has no faith and things. But he did download the Bible app. And he did start to go and try and read some of it. And we've been having these discussions. And this week in the office, I was telling my work colleagues, so I've been in the office on a Thursday. I normally don't go into the office on a Thursday. But this Thursday I was there because I was going to Joe's event afterwards. And it was more convenient to be in the office to then go to the event afterwards. So anyway, there was a couple of people. There was my work colleague who I sit next to, and another work colleague doesn't come in when I come in. Nice guy, really like him, has no faith. And I was telling him about what I was going to do. And we had this big discussion on faith, about evidence for God, and what things, you know, what questions would come up and how I'm going to answer them. And on Thursday, actually, when I actually went to the kitchen to go and get myself a coffee, I actually realised that the office was pretty full that day. You know, there was a good 7-8 people on my side of the office. Normally, there's only like 3 or 4. And they probably heard this conversation, which went on for probably about an hour. And I'm thinking, do you know what? I'm probably called to be here. Because who else is going to talk to them about the gospel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on, Adam.
You know, we all are in different situations. We come together, and this is great, the church, there's a power in the church. You know, this is where God, heaven and earth intersect, and we fuel one another up, and we encourage each other. But for most of our time, we're by ourselves. And that's where that integrity, that's where that fearing of God comes into effect. Because we're the ambassadors of Christ. And we go through and we may be the only interaction that people have with the gospel when they see the gospel present in our lives. Finally, I want to share the story of Hugh Latimer. He lived between 1487 and 1555. He was a bold preacher during the English Reformation. Latimer was invited to preach before King Henry VIII. And the king was known for executing those people who displeased him. It sounds a little bit like King Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't he? And he began his sermon with a remarkable internal dialogue spoken out loud. And he said in his sermon to the king, he said, Latimer, Latimer, be careful what you say. The king is here. And then he paused and continued, Latimer, Latimer, be careful what you do not say. The King of Kings is here.
Wow.
See, Latimer's reverence for God outweighed the earthly power of the king. He preached boldly, knowing full well what the cost would be. And eventually, he did pay the ultimate price. He was eventually burned at the stake for his faith by King Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Mary. And on his memorial, there were the words inscribed. He feared God so much that he feared no man. That's incredible. Isn't that a place to get to? To fear God so much that we fear no man. It's a very different type of fearing of God. Mordecai challenged Esther. Mordecai, the Jews, there was an edict to actually wipe out, to annihilate the Jewish race. Esther was part of the royal household. She was queen to the king. She may have survived that edict. She could have kept quiet about her background. But Mordecai, her uncle, challenges Esther in Esther 4, verse 14. He says to her, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your family will perish. And who knows but that what you have come to this royal position for such a time as this." See, no one lives out your situation. Your lives are unique. God designed it that way. And maybe you're the reason that you're in someone else's life. Maybe it's for such a time as this. Do not be afraid. Do not fear. We worship a living God, a God who is with you, a God who tells you to look at him during challenging situations. Then you'll be like Hananiah, because you'll be a man or woman of integrity who fear God more than most people do. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Adam. Some great pointers in there about fearing God more than most people, giving us ways and reasons to fear God more than most people. I appreciate the comments about like the boat being the safest place on earth, or the furnace being the safest place on earth. And sometimes we feel like our Christian life is not necessarily comfortable or pleasant or whatever, but we are, if we're with God, we're in the safest place. And thanks for really telling us that. And I appreciate as well you talking about your just your life, the way you end up in this 1 hour conversation with a colleague, and God engineers these things in our lives. And not necessarily just about coming to church. We are Christians throughout the whole week. When you're sharing your faith with colleagues in the office and it takes an hour of work time, you go, amen, that's a good, God's watching, the King of Kings was watching, so that was good. I appreciate, Marie and I went to a concert this week as well, and Suzanne was there as well. She brought her friend along and was able to reach out to her through that situation as well. That's fantastic. Just there's different ways that we can reach out to our friends aside from coming to church. So if you say, my friend wasn't to church today, okay, maybe they can come next week, but we can have other ways to reach out to our friends as well, which is great. And I appreciate the Hugh Latimer thing. I'd not really heard that story before. Careful what you say, the King is here, but careful what you don't say, because the King of Kings is here. And that's a good example of someone that fears God more than most. Let's just emulate that. Let's try and be those people that fear God more than most. Just a couple of announcements. Wednesday will be a men's meeting. We're going to be in the disciplines of a godly man, aren't we? Discipline of friendship this time. So that'll be 7:30 at my house. Then one other thing I want to just mention is on the 10th of May we'll have a women's service as well. That'll be a women-only service. There might be some men here to help set things up or serve the women in some ways, but it will be a chance for the women to own the service and put their stamp on it. So that's usually a good event in the women's calendar. So that will be the 10th of May. So the men will work out some kind of thing to do during that time as well. That's all I've got. We've got tea and coffee afterwards. We'll have a final song. Enjoy. Worship team.